I'm flipping through my notes. There were several pages in which, in all caps, I'm just like, just kiss her, you muppet. Everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I am Dr. Erin.
And gosh darn it if you are not welcome to our coverage of Bridgerton Season 2, Episode 4, where we are continuing to be confused as to all of the heavy breathing, but in general are still not hyper... So here's what I'm going to say. This is where the book really breaks. Because in the last episode, when they decided to not have someone walk in on them...
In flagrante.
Like, he was sucking the venom out of her boob in the book, and Porsha Featherington finds them. When they make that decision, this is where everything bifurcates.
Yeah.
And they made a decision as a writing team to tell a specific story. Mm-hmm. Holding both the story they're telling, which I think they did a very good job with, the story they chose to tell, they told well, and the story I prefer is kind of the tension that we will be exploring for the next 5 episodes.
Yeah.
That we both prefer the one that already existed, but I refuse to say that this one was garbage.
Yeah, and like we had this conversation this morning offline. Like, it's a good story. They tell a good story. Season 2 is a cohesive season for the stories they wanted to tell. I have some problems with the stories they're choosing to tell, and what that means for these characters, especially how it differs from the book. But I can't criticize like anything about how the show was a show in terms of like casting, acting, storyline, plot development, where we had a lot of like fits and starts in season 1.
Yeah.
This is a show that knows who it is.
Absolutely. And our Eleanor made the really great point that Shondaland as a brand is usually more concerned with plot than character. And It's a very specific show that can balance both. There's not that many I can think of, like, honestly. And even within a show that's multi-season, it's like, well, this season they balanced it well, and this season they didn't. Friday Night Lights, right. Very famously. 1 and 5, they balanced perfectly. 2, 3, and 4 were varying degrees of success. And Shonda just leans in to plot. And she kind of moves her characters around the plot. And so it doesn't... There's not a lot of stopping and thinking of, like, would this character do this? It's right. This character has to do this so I can tell this story. That's a valid storytelling choice. And there are people that love that. I was not quite prepared, and I should have been, for how quickly this was going to start to feel like Grey's Anatomy in corsets.
Yeah, I mean, and it was... We talked about this in the first 3 episodes, I think, although a lot has happened since we filmed them, but I think we talked about this. At some stage, like, we knew they were promoting it as a love triangle, but we didn't know if that was just to get people into it or if they were actually going to follow through with the love triangle aspect. And I mean, that's what we learned at the end of episode 3, right? The bee sting happens, and, like, Anthony eventually proposes anyway, out of like a blind panic. So that doesn't happen in the book, and now we're like committed to this. We're telling a love triangle story, and that's where we end up at the start of this episode, and where we're kind of like, okay, it's because weren't there love triangles on Grey's? I don't remember, but
I'm sure. Yes, there were.
There's like, wasn't it like Karev and Izzy and somebody else, and I don't know.
Yeah, and then I feel like Callie was involved in one, and then there's the whole like McDreamy was and Addison and Meredith.
Oh yeah. That was like the primo love triangle. So it's very on brand for Shonda. It's not super on brand for the Good Doctors, but we'll see where it takes us.
It took us a lot of places in episode 4, though, because so we end the episode with Anthony Panic proposing, which is, I'll be really honest, how I've always dreamed of being proposed to, because a gentleman is panicking.
While he looks at my sister instead of me. Great.
While he looks at my sister instead of me. Dreams coming true all over the place. So what we have here is that the rest of the ton is coming in for this house party. I loved all of the extra stuff in this episode. I loved the Regency traffic jam. I loved all of the preparations. I loved the conversations about flowers. I loved all of that. Minor moment here, because a costume design video I watched this week, plus just not natural knowledge. There would not be this vibrant fabric in the Regency. All of those colors are synthetic, but God, am I so glad they leaned into them, because it is just gorgeous. A sumptuous show to watch.
It's visually stunning. I love all of it. And I'm just like, we've accepted the ahistoricalness of it.
Yeah.
It just is. I still see a lot of historians on Twitter mad about how bad they are at history. I'm like, they're not trying to be good at history. Just let it go.
Yeah.
Just let it go.
Why are you here? So, several things I loved in this episode. Benedict is having the damn time of his life with Anthony's discomfort.
No.
Things I didn't love in this episode, Colin. So let's really briefly discuss Colin's storyline. He decides that he has to go see Marina to, I don't know, put the past in the past. I don't even understand.
See how she is? I don't know. It made no sense to me. I didn't care for it.
And what we find out is that Marina had twins. She is not happy, but she is content, and she needs Colin to go back and fall in love with Penelope. That's like... But of course, in Regency England, we can't say things. So there was a lot of like hinting that he misinterprets. We find out later on, which also happens in the books, not the Marina visit. But people constantly push Colin towards Penelope in the books. And he completely misunderstands it until book 4. Just completely misunderstands.
Bless him. Bless
God
him.
love him. We see a really cool conversation with him and Philip in the way that I think they're bringing Sir Philip into the story. And again, in the books, as a reminder, he is Eloise's happily ever after. We do not know how they're going to get there, because book Eloise and show Eloise are very, very, very divergent.
Very different.
But it appears that they want Sir Philip still part of this world. So curious. That'll be fun to watch. Back on the...
And I mean, we even got the children named as well, because the children are a huge part of Eloise's book as well. So the twins, and they are named Oliver and Amanda, which is their names in the book. There's a bit... Like, I'm always fascinated with how they're choosing children's names in this show so far. I mean, the only children we have really is Simon and Daphne's first child, which is not the same name as the child has in the book. Because they do things alphabetically in terms of naming Simon and Daphne, but their first child is a girl, I think, and it's Amelia.
Yeah, it's Amelia.
And so this one is a boy. And August, I don't know. Everyone calls him Augie. I'm assuming it's August. I don't know. Or just
Augustine,
Augie.
Maybe. Yeah.
Or just Augie, because the Brits are weird. But we I was having this comment conversation with one of our followers, Cyber Lucy, in the comments this morning, just saying, like, it was very intentional that they brought Sir Philip and Marina into this episode. They did not need to for the story. And I guess in terms of how it's developing Colin, I'm still not sure they know what they're doing with Colin this season. I'm not sure I knew what they were doing with Colin this season. If anybody else does, let us know.
No, Luke Newton is playing it very confused. This is not as strong of a performance as season 1 from him.
Correct. Like, in my mind, in terms of ranking Bridgerton brothers, like, Benedict far outshone Colin this season in terms of, like, likability and consistency. I was just, like, in love with every scene we got with Benedict. But yeah, they're doing something with this. But as we talked about offline before we started filming, like, I don't know how they reconcile the Eloise they're showing us with the Eloise in her book, where she ends up, spoilers a go-go, folks, if you didn't already know, like, living on the estate, raising Sir Philip's children. explain to me how feminist Eloise can't do anything in the ton ever.
Like, literally can't even just do one dance to make her mother happy.
Can't do one dance without having meaningful conversation. Is just going to be happy to live with a botanist on a estate in the country.
Which it was so funny. I was sitting there. I was like, Eloise, I respect your energy. Sweet 18-year-old Eloise. Let's do one dance.
Just dance, child. Yeah, I love Eloise even in this season, even though she frustrates me. She's
got real 18-year-old Kristen energy. So So
you're like, I know where this goes. Pump those brakes, Eloise.
But I would have danced because I was terrified of disappointing people.
Terrified of disappointing, yeah.
Which Eloise does not have that gene.
Does not appear to have that gene. Yeah, so it was an interesting development for Eloise in this episode, in terms of just solidifying that she really can't hack it in the ton. She doesn't want to. She has no will to. She is like terrified of disappointing her mother, but not so much that she can fake performativity or fake engagement. Like, we get this throughout the whole season where she's like constantly apologizing to her mother for being a disappointment, but then not able to stomach a dance with a random dude. Which is, again, very 18-year-old energy.
So the other storyline we have going on, something happens with the Featheringtons I don't care about. Sorry.
No, you don't care about the Featheringtons. But what happens is, I'll just briefly do this because I know the Featherington storyline.
It just exhausts me existentially.
It annoys you. Yeah, and like at this stage, I wasn't tired of it as you were. But by the end, by episode 8, I was like, why do I care? And so we'll get to that when we talk about episode 8 in terms of like what the conclusion of that storyline was. I was like, are you flipping kidding me? But we do learn in this episode that, Porsha has forced Prudence, Philippa's
already married with the dowry that,
that doesn't exist. Forces Prudence into a marriage with Lord Whistledown, or Lord Featherington now. And he eventually admits to her that, like, y'all, I was fortune hunting because I have no money. I'm broke as a joke. There are no rubies in Georgia, which we called, lol JK. And I was trying to get Cressida Cowper so I could save the family. Now, this is the point where I was like, just have this conversation. You already know Porsha Featherington is meddlesome, manipulative, and petrified for her daughters. Just pull her aside and say, I'm going to be real with you. I sense some antagonism with you and the Cowpers. We need the money.
Yeah.
Let me do this. We'll all be okay.
Yeah. I agree. Cressida is odious, but her dowry is not. So.
And I don't have money. So stop with this nonsense. I can't marry your daughter. I promise, let you just stay out of my way or help me, convince Cressida to marry me, and I'll provide large dowries and I'll introduce Prudence to somebody and get her married. I know that is your concern. But then, there's no drama that way. And this goes to your point about Shondaland being about plot versus character. Because character-wise, from what they've shown us of Jack and Porsha, I think they would have had that conversation. But plot-wise, they couldn't have had that conversation because then we wouldn't get 5 more episodes of dramas.
But unfortunately, we do. So that's what's happening with the Featheringtons. There's not a lot of Pen in this episode either, or a ton of Pen Louise. It's where we really spend the bulk of our time is on the love triangle that shouldn't exist. But all that to say, there are... Overall, I'm flipping through my notes. There were several pages in which, in all caps, I'm just like, just kiss her, you muppet. What my frustration is that they're obviously telling the story of love versus duty. This has been clear since the jump. Since the first episode, it was even clear in last year's finale. That this is the conversation of love versus duty. And I appreciate that they're setting up Kate as a perfect foil for Anthony. That they are both people who have taken this on themselves. No one asked them to do it. Mm-hmm. But they have completely convinced themselves that this is what everyone requires of them. And so they are in this war, and I just kept, like, I wrote down a few times, like, someone has seen Hamilton too many times. Because we were really leaning into Angelica, Eliza, and Alex throughout this dynamic. And I said, the thing with Angelica Schuyler, first of all, she was married already in real life, but even the way that Lynn writes her in the musical, Angelica knows that she cannot have Alex. So she stays in love with him, but steps aside. Kate, our Kate, like, you either be Angelica or you stake your claim.
Girl.
This is it. You be Angelica or you stake your claim. Because if you loved Edwina, which I do believe you do, but if you could understand all of the facets of love, you would understand that love includes clear communication. Mm-hmm. Edwina deserves to know that one of the reasons he hasn't proposed to her yet is that he is in love with you. Like, she deserves to know.
Yeah, and at that stage, I don't know that they're in love, but certainly in lust, and certainly not in love
not
with
nothing.
Edwina.
Yeah.
Not nothing. Yeah, and I mean, we see in this episode, we get a couple instances of Kate and Anthony coming real close to snogging and not snogging. As you said offline before we started, this is the only time that a gun has ever been sexy.
Seriously, first and only time in my life, yeah.
Ooh, I mean, we should say this, because as much as we have problems with what they did with this love triangle and Kate and Anthony, we have zero problems with Simone Ashley and Jonathan Bailey.
I mean, less than zero.
Ever. Their chemistry is fire. I love them.
I love too. I watched an interview with him this week where he said it was very important for him to take this role as an out gay man because he wanted to show out gay boys that they could get cast and be believed that they were falling in love with women. And I was like, yes, case in point, Anthony Bridgerton. Like,
case number one, Jonathan Bailey. They're just phenomenal. And I think they do, as we said, right? Like, it's a good story and it's told well. And they do a good job convincing us that there is this push and pull between desire and wants and the duty and responsibility they've told themselves they have to uphold. So they do a really good job of that. But we get to this, like, freaking library scene. There's lots of things happen in libraries in this episode, but none of it is Anthony and Kate kissing, which is just obnoxious.
Should always be more snogging. Always.
And I saw a really interesting article. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but we'll probably link it in the show notes to this anyway, where it says that, like, Sanditon and Bridgerton season 2s turned away from sex to romance. And I was like, there's no sex in Austen. What are you talking about? Like, there was no sex in season 1 of Sanditon. But it's an interesting point for season 1 and season 2 of Bridgerton, because they really went low on the sex end. Like, real low. We got 3 sex scenes total, I think. One of them was like a in and out, pun intended, with Benedict. And then the 2 with Kate and Anthony. But yeah, I mean, I think I just wrote in all caps, staring, breathing, and sighing. Because that is what they do when they're around each other in private.
And in reality, if they were in this situation, if they were real humans, that's what they'd be doing. If they have made this choice to not confront Edwina, if they're going to stay on this train, then that's all they can do, because they are people of honor. And they're not going to act on anything while Edwina is still as part of it. So there's a good chunk of me that actually respects this amount of sighing. Because if you're going to make this choice to not set them up in episode 4, if to not have them kiss and then immediately go and break off the, not get engaged. If you're going to set it up that you are going to see this love triangle through, then you have to have them get this tension so intense that by the time they finally do kiss, which, spoiler alert, happens in episode 6, it's like all they have to do is breathe on the tension and it collapses.
That's true.
But
that's true. I appreciate that argument. I think it's part of my like head canon. Like it's part of the book in my head where I'm just like, why are we doing this? Sorry, you had a but. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, but this isn't. I talk a lot about low-hanging fruit in terms of stories. That the easiest story to tell is not often the best one, like the rough draft. I don't know if this version was Julia Quinn's rough draft, but to me it feels like it. Because the more interesting story, the story that lets us explore who they all are, is the story that removes Edwina from the engagement way earlier and lets Edwina be her own person and can grow. And we don't, as the audience, have to keep going, oh girl, you're going to get your heart broken. Oh girl, like, we don't have to pity her the way they are setting us up to pity her. They are setting us up to view her as a naive child. And that's not fair to her. And so to me, this is the easiest story to tell and therefore the laziest. I appreciate that there are people that for whom they love triangle at the same level that I love enemies to lovers. I completely respect that. I hope they found extreme joy in this season, because I do think it is, as love triangles go, impeccably told. It's built really well. All of it is done properly. All three of them know just what they're doing. It's really, really, really good. Again, like I said at the beginning, this is just not the story I would prefer that they tell. But if they were going to set up the fact that this is a love triangle, I'm glad they didn't make out in the library. Like, if they had kissed, and then I would have been like, okay, someone's going to tell Edwina right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Right now is when we break off the engagement? No? Okay, then don't kiss.
And I think, like, as you were talking, I was just thinking in my head, like, you know, friends to lovers, or enemies to lovers is one of our favorite tropes, full stop, in the romance that we read for both of us. And I was thinking about this over the weekend when I was thinking about this season. And, like, for me, the much more interesting story is that you force them to get engaged and married when they're not sure how they feel about each other. And what that would do is give us the same story of Kate and Anthony finding themselves to being in love with each other by the end of episode 7. But a lot more of them together.
Yeah, and that's a chief complaint of the series. At this point, as I was watching episode 4, you know, it's hard because I watched it after it all came out, and so the hot takes have all been running wild. And all of it, I just kept thinking, like, okay, how many of these hot takes just refuse to see that that the story they chose to tell is still well built?
Yeah.
And what does that look like? I will say that we should pause here and say that one of the other kind of chief complaints is that even though we are very excited by the representation, and there are many South Indian, Southeast Asian voices I've heard that are, we should acknowledge that it is a mismatch. There are words from different parts of the culture. We're going to go on and see more traditions that they just kind of pick. I have a friend who grew up in Chennai who says that to her, it just really, really feels like a first-generation British Indian immigrant. Like, it's somebody who gets the diaspora rather than the actual.
Yeah.
And she's not bothered by it, but she respects other people that are. So we want to bring it up that for people, there is this, like, push and pull where it is representation and it does feel lived in and it does feel normal for many. And then for others, it's not great. And so a reminder that representation is always a journey. Always something, because you can make someone feel seen and not someone others, even when you assume you're going to make both people feel seen. So I wanted to say that.
Yeah.
And one of the other critiques as to why some people are actually glad there wasn't a forced marriage is the statement that they're really glad that Kate wouldn't have been forced to marry a colonizer. And I want to address that really briefly. And I want to remind everybody that we're in 1813.
Yeah.
At that point in time, it is not, do I think that the character of Kate may have seen him as a colonizer? It's entirely possible. But looking at diaries and writings and letters from high-ranking, upper-class Indian folks in the early 1800s, it is not a foregone conclusion she would have seen him as a colonizer.
Right.
It is a foregone conclusion that she would have seen him as a wallet. but there wasn't this within the upper class. You just can't make the assumption, at least from my reading of Indian history, until the late 1800s. So I just want to remind everybody that we're in 1813.
In case you weren't sure. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point to bring up, because it's so easy for us to take our lens and apply it back on a history. And they are muddling with history in this show. They are being ahistorical in a lot of ways, but one of the ways they're not, and you and I talked about this last week, is that it would not be ahistorical to have wealthy or relatively wealthy. Obviously, the Sharmas don't have a lot of money, and that's why they're trying to get Edwina married. But they have enough money to travel from India to England, which is not cheap or easy. They have connections in terms of the Sheffield line of things and Lady Danbury, and enough to support them in a very expensive venture, which is a season. And that would not have been ahistorical for an Indian family to do, in the way that having a black duke was a bit more ahistorical in the first season. But I think that's another thing people are talking about in terms of that. So it wouldn't have been ahistorical. And I mean, I agree with you. And I would say probably we didn't really have the language of colonizer back then.
No, not really. I mean, for sure, we have massive rebellions, but it's peasant farmers in the 1800s.
It's peasant farmers. And, when you and I talked about this over the weekend, we were talking about the Maharaja system in India that existed throughout the 19th century, and how wealthy, upper caste Indians benefited from this and perpetuated the system because it made them wealthy and powerful and all of this kind of stuff. And, I know we're meant to think the Sharmas are kind of middle class in the middle there because,
especially because Kate is darker than Edwina and Lady Mary.
Yeah, and we do know that Appa was a clerk, so that's not like a super high position, but it's a paid position. It's a stable position, depending on how and where he was clerking. So I think that is important that you brought it up. I hadn't heard that critique yet about Kate and Antony, because I've just suspended history from understanding Bridgerton. I'm like, colonization doesn't even come into my head because it's just like.
I think it's important to bring these things up.
Yeah.
But in the same way that we say that individuals, while they can be held accountable, potentially for mistakes they made, we can't hold people responsible, in a certain way. It just feels like if we can have 2022 soundtrack and fabrics and acknowledge that this is still existing in a world of 1813.
Right.
There's already, it's Shonda, guys. There's so many plot holes. There was never mines in America. This isn't one that there's so many holes.
Well, there were mines, just not ruby mines.
So excuse me. I don't know if there was a whole lot of gem mines in Georgia. Could please somebody from Georgia correct me? In my mind, those did not ever exist. But please let me know if I'm wrong. I think they cast ahistorically in some ways. They were in, honestly, Edwina looks nothing like Lady Mary. They weren't, they don't have the same bone structure at all. They weren't really looking for that. None of the Bridgerton kids look alike. They weren't trying to do CSI level stuff. You're right. But I think it's still worth a conversation where you fast forward 150 years. There's no way that someone like Kate would have entered into an arranged marriage. Unless, but then again, we got duty. People do things all the time out of duty. So it's a messier conversation than Twitter is willing to have about this, which is...
What? Shocking.
And again, our knowledge of India, while we've certainly studied it, I've been there, I have friends who are Indian, et cetera, et cetera. If there was a middle or upper class rebellion in the early 1800s and I haven't heard about it, please let me know. All of the knowledge that I have says that we need to remember that this was 1813.
Mm-hmm. I think the only other thing I want to say from this episode, we do get some development with Penelope in terms of her I think it's important for her arc as a character where she is starting to think about how her writing impacts people.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, yeah.
And that is a huge part of Penelope's arc as she decides whether or not to continue as Lady Whistledown and what it means to be Lady Whistledown and how she can use her pen, her quill. So it is setting up what happens later on in the show, in this season as well, with her and Eloise. But she starts to think about, like, because there's a tense conversation with Colin where she asks him about his visit with Marina, and he says, you know, did we make it worse? Did Lady Whistledown writing about it make it worse and, like, force her hand? And so she's thinking about, like, the consequences of her actions. I mean, she did it at the time to save Colin from marrying someone who was being dishonest, but her actions also had consequences for Marina. So I thought that was important, and it creates this tension with Colin and Pen that, like, I don't know how they're going to resolve it, but that tension does happen in the books because eventually he gets mad at her when he finds out she's Whistledown. Not because she's Whistledown, but because it, like, puts her at risk, but that's in the books. So, like, I think they're creating that tension so that, like, the revelation creates friction between them. I'm not sure. I'm a little unsure about that, but I think, you know, in terms of developing Penelope Featherington and her relationship with her alter ego as Lady Whistledown, we get a lot more of it in the show than we ever do in the books, until Penelope's book. But I'm glad they're doing it now. I haven't decided yet how I feel about how they ended it this season, so stay tuned for future episodes to see if I've made up my mind whether I like it or not. But it's an interesting position to put Penelope in, as she is also trying to, like, maintain her money-making machine with the help of everyone else on Team Whistledown, including Madame Delacroix, who I love that we see starts, like, hiding the pamphlets in dresses. I was like, ooh, that's so, like, suffragist. Yes. Yeah.
I think a lot moved. Everything always moves in this show, again, because it's very plot-driven. But I think I want to say that one of my favorite, I love Daphne coming back and just needling the absolute living hell out of Anthony. I love that. I love Lady Danbury in All Times and All Things.
All Times, All Things.
And yeah, I think that's all I've got to say. Everything else goes into episode 5, Unthinkable Fate. So I think
unsinkable.
Also unsinkable. So I think we'll pause here and we will see you for episode 5.
Bye, everybody.